My name is Kiaba. I am a fine art and portrait photographer from Rhinebeck, New York. And tonight I want to share with you some images from my newest body of work that recently won the Julia Margaret Cameron Award because it is about my journey reframing my perspective on beauty, especially as it pertains to femininity and your personal value. So if you could go to the next slide, please. In order to talk about this project, I have to give you a little bit of personal background. I am the eldest of 5 children, and I was born into the Unification Church. For those of you that are younger and are not familiar with the group, it is a religious movement that was started by the late Reverend Sung Myung Moon in Korea in the 1950s, and it had its heyday in the United States in the 1970s and the 80s. Reverend Moon is best remembered in popular culture for his mass arranged marriages. So tonight, in order to tell you what I learned on my journey about how that ideology framed my sense of beauty, femininity, and value, and then what I learned from leaving the group, I actually need to take you into my youth a little bit. So next slide, please. Essentially, I have to invite you down the rabbit hole of the illogic that I learned growing up. So I put this slide in here to kind of discuss the immortal words of Lewis Carroll as we go down. We will start at the beginning, and when I get to the end, I will stop. Next slide, please. So the beginning of this journey finds us, according to church legend, Reverend Moon on his 15th birthday was praying on top of a mountain on Easter morning, and Jesus came to him and said, dying on the cross was actually not my mission. I failed my mission, and it is your job to come and restore humanity as the Messiah. Next slide, please. So by the time Reverend Moon's church gained traction in the United States, many parents were afraid of losing their children to the organization. Basically, they would hire deprogrammers, they would kidnap their children and take them to hotels and read them Bible verses for hours on end because the group cut off financial access to the young people that were in the group and discouraged interaction with their families. Next slide, please. So my parents were married along with 2,000 other people in Madison Square Garden right up the road on July 1st, 1982. And I am the eldest of 5 children that were born supposedly sinless human beings, the first in humanity that were part of God's lineage. They actually believed we would be completely perfect beings. That was such a disappointment. So one of the things that I want to talk to you about is this idea that comes from the theological text called the divine principle. It is sort of this combination of biblical text and Eastern mysticism, and they have a very interesting statement of beauty in here. It says, love is an emotional force given by the subject, love is an emotional force. I have completely lost, okay, I'm going to paraphrase because I've got an image right in the middle of the text. Basically, love is something that God gives to humankind. The love is an active force, and God is the subject, mankind is the object. And then in the man-woman relationship, man is the subject, he is giving love in an active way, and woman returns beauty in a passive way. So I learned essentially that as a woman, I was passive, I was an object, and my entire being was about giving beauty to a man. And that I was supposed to remain pure until Reverend Moon chose a husband for me. Because in the Unification Church, one did not date. We referred to one another as brother and sister, and in order to emphasize platonic relationships, we had to dissociate ourselves from any hormonal, sexual, or emotional contact. So sex before marriage was completely out of the question. If you did have sex before marriage, it was considered falling, and that was the worst crime that you could commit against God. And the church also believed that the fall of man in the biblical sense was a sexual sin, and that Eve had a sexual, spiritual relationship with Lucifer, and thus brought evil into the world. It's very kinky. So we had this very interesting cultural dichotomy in which we were taught that the ideal role of woman is to give beauty, but we were also taught, like in many religions, that sin entered the world through a woman. So woman's job is to cut off from herself in order to not give sexual temptation to anybody, and essentially cut off from her sexuality as a whole, And purity is the defining value for a woman, and it is through the lens with which you are able to express your value, which is beauty, but once you're married. So we were taught to act and dress and think modestly so as not to lead the men into temptation. Next slide, please. So it took me until I was 21 to leave the church. I had been coerced into an arranged marriage, and it took me 2 years from that point until I was 21 to get out of and get the financial and emotional resources to leave. And interestingly enough, it was on a flight from JFK to Oslo to visit my then husband that I met a young woman sitting next to me, and in order to entertain me on the plane, she gave me some Cosmo magazines. But being Romanian, I couldn't actually read them. So this was sort of what I was presented with. And it was the first time that I had encountered media that showed women that to me at the time seemed free to express their identity and their sexuality. So it was kind of an eye-opening experience for me, and it was sort of a turning point where I realized that I needed to leave in order to express who I felt I was. But it took me many years after leaving the group to realize that the current culture that we live in actually has very many similar problems as the religious group that I grew up in. So we look at a culture that looks at a woman's value in particular from a very binary point of view. We have the hot or not scale, we have the slut or whore scale, and there's not a whole lot in between. So essentially we still have this idea that a woman's value is coming from this arbitrary standard of beauty. It's not a foreign one, and it's not one that exists only within religious groups. Women's bodies and their sexuality is also very politicized. It seems like every time I turn on the news, there's new proposed legislation that's trying to cut women off from access to contraception or trying to engage with women's sexuality on some level. Can we go to the next slide, please? We also have this wonderful resurgence of purity culture with more right-wing groups, which has helped give rise to some of this political discourse that's going on right now. And one of my favorites is this phenomenon like the purity ball, in which young women pledge their virginity to their fathers until their husbands come along to claim them. Next slide, please. So it seems to me that the problematic equation is presenting itself again and again. We have woman as object, we have woman as passive, and we have woman as either completely pure until an outside authority figure deems it okay for a woman to engage sexually, and then with only within certain constructs, or we have woman completely sexually available and acting literally as an object. And this did not take me very long to find on the internet. I was like, oh, okay. Unsurprisingly, this kind of objectification has been linked by psychologists to shame, depression, substance abuse, and sexual dysfunction. So for me, I'm a photographer and I work mainly with women, and one of my main concerns is facilitating a conversation around body image and body love, both before, during, and after the session. And my goal as a photographer is to give women a safe space to witness themselves and also to celebrate their unique beauty without a subjective standard being inserted. The problem is that in order to facilitate that kind of conversation, I have to go on that journey myself. And it was a really long time before I was ready to share the story that I've just shared with you. And it was even longer before I was ready to turn the lens on myself. But I realized that in order for me to make myself available as a photographer for women in the capacity that I wanted to act, I needed to tell my story and I needed to turn my lens on myself. And that is where the newest body of work that I have done has come from. And you can go to the next slide, please. This is a body of work that I call Burdens of a White Dress, and it addresses the pervasive cultural norms that I see both in femininity in my childhood cultural origin and also in our current beauty culture. So this first slide is a piece that I called Hold Your Peace, and it comes from my personal experience of being coerced into a relationship where I did not have the chance to actually say vows or to say whether or not I was in the situation under duress. But at the same time, I also see that a lot of young women are being coerced into feminine roles that they have not had a chance to have any conversation around. And that's very important to me. So I want to be able to have a conversation around the fact that women need to have the opportunity to explore their needs and their goals first. And I also want to talk about how women need to not be bound by these cultural notions of purity and virginity as virtues, and they are not something that a man, a father, or a husband should have be able to lay claim over. Next slide, please. So this next slide is an image that I call "My Mind is a Lie," and it also addresses this idea that for young women, the cultural norms that we are raised within are essentially lies to some degree. And I really want to ask viewers to consider what is at stake. Essentially, both men and women remove their logic and their humanity from the equation when we fill our heads with the dehumanizing constructs that I've discussed before. So we really need to consider, what does it mean to be beautiful, what does it mean to be desirable, and what is at the core of where a woman's value lies. Next slide, please. This next image is at the helm. And for me, this is a very personal image in that I felt completely alone and out to sea when I left my culture of origin. But at the same time, I also feel that a lot of women similarly navigate a very stormy sea completely alone when they're trying to figure out what their feminine identity is. And it's important to me to note that in many of these images, the woman is blindfolded, not only to talk about how she cannot see where she is going, but it also dehumanizes the subject. And I feel like our pervasive cultural norms are very dehumanizing to both men and women. Next slide, please. So this is jumping forward a little bit in the chronology of the project, and this image is called Matched. And this deals with an overarching theme in my childhood about the way that women are raised and treated, expected to come to the marriage state as completely pure and virtuous, and also completely malleable. Because sexual activity that was uncondoned was supposed to align you to Satan, it basically meant in our culture that any kind of uncondoned sexual activity made you a murderer. But again, I have to reflect on how this ideology pertains to our culture at large. We see this treatment of women in other cultures, but I really want people to examine how this is present within our own culture as well, because we see so many instances of women being devalued for their sexual experience. And I feel that that hurts both men and women. Next slide, please. All right, so to take this idea even further, I want to share with you a short story around this image. This one is called The Purity Knife, and this references a time when I was 17. We were told we had to go live in vans and fundraise for the church in order to understand God better. And while I was fundraising, I found out that a good friend of mine had been killed. She had been sexually assaulted and then strangled. And the church tried to cover this up, and they tried to talk about how she hadn't been violated because otherwise that kind of put her into this very strange cultural place, and they wanted to uphold her. But then they also wanted to make sure that none of us actually left the program. So again, they tried to cover it up, and then when they sent us back out onto the streets, they gave us mace and personal alarms. They didn't think about that at the beginning. And some mothers gave their daughters something called a purity knife. And I was like, oh my God, what is that? And apparently the idea was that if somebody were to attack you, you had the opportunity to kill yourself first. And this is a notion that actually comes from old Korean culture. It's an ideological relic, but young women of high birth were given an ornamental knife in order to commit suicide, to protect their virginity instead of defending themselves. And this was not something that was necessarily steeped in our ideology, but I did some research into Reverend Moon's speeches, and I found some wonderful quotes. Moon did recommend that members, quote, carry a knife to kill yourself before you will be violated. And according to Moon, if somebody is trying to invade you, you should rather kill yourself than fall. At least you won't go to hell that way. Even if you die, you don't go to hell. And so for me, when I read that, I was like, oh, that sounds just like the victim shaming that we hear in our news every day. America has seen many instances of that terrible kind of shaming, with the Steubenville rape case being one of the most recent. And so, again, I just want to kind of come back to this idea that we have a culture in which women are being raised to be passive objects. We are being raised as beautiful objects for somebody else's consumption, But we're also being told that our choices in matter of dress, of drink, and behavior means that we deserve to be victims that are acted upon. So at the end of the day, I want us to reconsider what is beauty. Is beauty what our culture is so pervasively trying to convince us that it is? Are we a commodity to be owned and subjugated? Or is it something less tangible, less binary than the hot or not, pure or sullied, virgin or whore, subject or object, and even male or female scale that we have been presented? Next slide, please. To me, beauty is a spark that exists within a person. It is not something that can be owned or objectified. And so I'm actually leaving you with a piece in progress. This is called Rewiring, and it's sort of in its sketch stages. And I want to just say that, you know, there are many varied shades of beauty that I think that we should open ourselves up to. But we need to do some rewiring. Next slide, please. And we also need to emerge anew into a completely different perspective on beauty and its varied and manifold forms. And that's it. Thank you very much.